Well, hello and welcome back. And we are continuing messing around with our shortener, and we're specifically going to be doing some updates to our API. And specifically, we're going to cover a couple of things that we want to do, which is basically answering a question: how do I document my API? And we're going to deal with a thing called Swagger, which is a very useful tool, as you're going to see fairly quickly. We're going to do this into two parts because it's going to take a little bit, because we're first going to have to actually tweak our code a little bit to make it more, say, Swagger friendly. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can make our stuff really look clean. So now, last time around, we had our API look roughly like this. We've actually updated it on the delete, but I'm just sort of going back to essentially the problem here being that our format is we have this shorten, and within that, we basically just look at the request method, and we say, okay, within that, how are we going to handle it? So if it's a post, we're going to go do that. If it's a get, we're going to do that. When we switch over to Swagger, it is going to want to, what it's going to do is it's going to give us something that looks like this. And actually, let me blow this up a little bit. So what we've got is, and it is documentation. So if we click on this, we're going to see here's what all of our endpoints are, and we can actually click on it and we can see what it looks like. We can actually even test it. This is currently running, so I can try it out. If I do a hello and I execute it, there's no parameters for it. Then it says, okay, so here's roughly what a curl would look like. Here's what the response or the request URL looks like. Boom, here's what the response was. And I can do it, I can play around with it, but here everything is a JSON response. So we're just gonna, that's what it's gonna kick it back. And it says, hey, here's a response code. Much like if we went over to our Postman and we just did a, I believe this is hello, we just call it hello. Then, yep, you're gonna get the same thing. See if I can get that back there. So there you go. So this documentation, and I can clear it, this allows us to very quickly, as we're going to see, document our API and make it useful for other people. Now in our case, there's not a whole lot we need to do, but as you get a more complicated API, this becomes incredibly valuable. It is very useful to have a way to go in particular, things like this. So I could go in and I can actually run a query and try it out and see what it looks like without having to set up Postman, without having to set up all of this other stuff. As long as the API is out there running, I can test it, and I can test it live as it is. This is automatically updating documentation. And if you say, wow, that's awesome, well, that's what we're going to talk about. That's what we're going to do it. So the first thing I want to mention is that when we first did this with the APIs, we took this approach. We're going to actually change it, and it's not that we're going to change it a lot. So this is what we had. And what we're going to do is we're going to change it over to this. And we're going to use some decorators because this is going to now become very important for how we make our API calls. We had them before, but we're going to tweak them just the slightest bit, and we're going to be able to add some documentation. So that's our first step. And all we have to do is each of these ifs is going to become a function with that name. So for example, here, since we have very simple stuff, all we have to do is we're going to take this post, we're going to create a function called post, we're going to have resource that's going to be sent to it, and they're going to return the JSON of the result. So as you can see here, before we were saying if the method's post, which is going to come in here, shorten is our class, and this is our endpoint, and it's got methods of get, post, and delete. So we've got, for example, post. We're going to come in, and all we're going to do is going to retrieve the new URL based off the form, JSONify the result, convert that to JSON, and return it, which is almost exactly what we did before. And we're going to do that for each of our methods. I'm not going to... And what we did here, if you remember, we'd come through and everything, we called it and then we JSONify it. But now we're going to just do that at each level. So it's just the slightest bit of code change for us to do this. That gives us now that we've got a class for basically each endpoint. And then we've got our heartbeat, which is hello. And this is our route. And then we've got within it, we don't actually say anything. We're going to assume the get, but we could just as easily do it this way and say that it has a get, a post, and a delete. And if you look at our documentation, by default, it has a get. If we change it to specifically state that it has a get, and we come back and run it, then yeah, we see the same thing. Now, if we wanted to do a, let's do a delete, what we'll see is here, if we do a delete and return, let's say, sorry, delete is not available. And we give it a delete here. And we reset it. Then we're going to see here, delete is now available. Notice they're actually color coded. We could go in here, we could try it out, execute it. Delete is not available. There you go. And we can even, there's a bunch of stuff we can do with this, but the key here is that we get to do our, where I want to roll that back up. What I want to do is be able to see our endpoints and our documentation. And it's, as you can see, fairly full featured. It's like, okay, what are the parameters? What are the responses? Now you'll note we have, as we've seen before, there's like a default, there's no parameters, and you have a code of 200. Now there may be other ones that it returns, but we'll talk about that essentially in part 2. What I want to do is just get us started on this for this part. Now, the thing that we need to do before is we had Flask, and we had JSONify, and we had requests. And we were using shortener and Flask CRS. I believe we talked about that, and it was basically just to avoid cross-site issues. What we're going to do is we're going to bring in this thing called Flask RESTX. And all you have to do to bring it in is do a pip3 install Flask _ RESTX, RESTX. And when you do that, boom, you're going to be able to do it. It'll run through your stuff. It'll install. Then you're going to want resource, which is this thing that we see here. And you're going to want API. Now, before we used app equals Flask name, just gets us going. It's like, boom, we've got our API. Remember, Flask is super easy, so we use app and we're off and running. However, what we're going to do for the documentation side of it is we're going to create this new thing called API, and we're going to use the Flask RESTX, very difficult to say quickly, API, and we're going to use app and we're going to stuff it in there. So we're basically just going to wrap around our app this API stuff. And we're still going to do the cores on the app, not the API itself. Now, you can do the most basic version is if you just wrap it, you're going to get a bunch of default stuff. So I'm going to come in here. If I go look at my documentation, then it's just API. It assumes version 1.0. There you go. Now there's some things that we can add here, which is what I did. So here I add that, hey, this is going to be version 1.0. The title is Shorty API, and a description. I'm going to say like, okay, I'll change a little bit, but here are the calls and examples for the Shorty API, dplink.us for more information. So we can do that. And when we do that, let's see. So we'll go look at what that looks like. And now what we're going to see is now our title is Shorty API instead of just API. We have a base URL. We have a version that we did, and then we've got this little documentation section. Now we can get pretty complex with this. I believe we can do, let's do this. I'll just do this. Just because. but we're going to look a little bit more at some of the tags and stuff that you can do. So if I do this, I think I can do straight up HTML. And if we do so, there we go. So I've got this is HTML text, so I can actually get pretty impressive with that. Base URL, I believe, is just base URL. So I could say, if for reasons it's something else, let's just say it was /shorty. I think that'll work. I'm playing around with this a little bit, but as you can see, oh, that wasn't it. Okay. However, we're not going to mess with that. We'll come back with that a little bit. Some more ways that we can do it, but it's basically we can like do some fairly complicated stuff here. I wonder if author. Apologies as I'm thinking through this, but there's a lot of little things in here, as you see with most auto documenting things. Oh, okay. I forgot my comma. If I go here, yeah, so author doesn't give me anything, but there's probably some tags in there. If I go look at the Swagger API, then I can look at, there's going to be other tags that I can do to that. If you want to look at swagger.json, this tells you basically everything that's come through. So this is how it generated this Swagger doc. So you could actually generate something, you could make some changes and do some funky stuff if you want to. That's not something we're going to talk about right now. So documentation wise, you can now see what it is that all of these endpoints are, and we can actually get into some of the specifics. Now, by default, we notice that there aren't any parameters. So we can get something useful, want to tell you how I got to this one, because I'm going to do that actually through all of these. So this is the get. And notice here, it's like here it says, hey, this is a short URL you want to decode, and it's a string that it's looking for. And if I try it out, I can enter a URL. Let me go enter a URL that makes sense. I think 6 will give me something. Yeah. So if I use this as my URL, I come back over here, I kick that in, then I'm going to see right here. Here we go. Here's my output. So code was 200. There you go. If I do something it doesn't like, let's see. If I do this, I think it'll blow it up. Yeah. So if I take this, I'm also going to see, if I go here, v execute, then I see data -1 error. So I'm going to I can actually play around with this, like I said, just like if I'm sitting in Postman. I can make the calls and actually get something fairly useful out of it. So I can do a lot of testing before I even set up anything else. I can do it right in here with Swagger, and notice that basically all I'm doing is all I did is I just basically have my routes. Now the exceptions are we went ahead here and we created methods for each of them. And so we did we did it a little bit differently, but not much. And now here is where, so we've got this at API doc. So I can do this pretty much anywhere that I want to. So what I could do is I could say that I'm sending a URL for each of these, but I'm not going to, because I'm going to, well, actually, let's do it that way. So if I want to cheat, I can do this. And now this is going to be up at that level. Let's take a look at what this looks like. So when I do it up at the class level, so each of the shortens now have URL as the as a parameter. So if I try it out with post, there we go. Okay. So if I want to do http my cool URL.com and I execute it, And in this case, it's because it's a post as opposed to just a regular parameter. So it's actually going to blow up because it didn't come up as a form. So what I really want to do is I want to take this down, and I'm going to do it on the get, and the post. But now here I'm going to need a form URL that I'm going to have to deal with in order to actually post it properly. Because here, let's see, yeah. See, it did it as a parameter as opposed to a form parameter, a form param. So we're going to talk about that next time around and get a little deeper into it. But right now what we've got is something that we've really changed almost nothing, and we have some pretty good documentation that we can do here. Now we can also do some other stuff like here, API doc. There's a lot that we can do here, but we could basically say, and I've got to remember what it is, but let's just do like a straight up, this is a test, bit O documentation. I think it has to have a name. I don't think it does it as a straight up string. I don't think it's going to like that. We're going to find out. If we come back, yeah, so it's not going to give us anything terribly useful. It doesn't know where to assign it. So we're going to step into this a little bit more next time around. I want to give us just a basic. So right now you could sit here and create a pretty solid document. Next time around, we're going to add some more things, show you where to look to add your own features, because a lot of this, as you've seen, is pretty full-featured. It's just a matter of knowing what those features are. So we will get back to you next time. Thanks a lot for your time. If you have any questions, send it out to email at info@developreneur.com. You can see some links around this YouTube site, as well as some of the other places. Check out school.developreneur.com if you want to get a little more involved in some of this kind of stuff. And definitely let us know what some of maybe the APIs that you're building and some of your little documentation things that you've figured out. And stick around next episode. We're going to get a little deeper into it. Have yourself a great day. We will talk to you next time.